we started recording. So we are again doing growing tomatoes in the desert Southwest, presented by Gardening with the Masters, the Sandoval Extension Master Gardeners program. Today we welcome Sam Thompson. Sam got serious about gardening when she took the Master Gardener Intern Training course in 2008. Her first career was as a research scientist, and gardening allowed and challenged her to keep on experimenting and to put into action all that she was learning. Now, Sam mentors new master gardeners, works with her daughter and granddaughter in their garden, and helps with many gardening projects around Sandoval County. She shares her love of gardening and her wisdom and excitement with others. If after today's presentation and this growing season, your garden is as prolific as Sam's, she says that our firefighters love garden-grown tomatoes for their BLT sandwiches. And now I give you Sam Thompson.
Thank you, Meg. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Next slide, please. The challenges that we face in the desert Southwest, I break down into three categories: low fertility soil, intense heat, and pests and diseases. So today I'm going to talk to you about those challenges and some ways that I have been trying to meet them. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Low fertility soil, what does that mean? That basically means there's a lack of organic material. Organic materials, plant and animal material that's in the process of decomposing in your soil. It's soil roots, it's compost basically that you've added. Next slide, please. Why do we want to have organic matter in the soil? The primary reason is it provides us with some good soil structure. Good soil structure allows water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide to move freely in the soil. And those are fundamental requirements for plant growth. If any of you have experienced soil compaction, where water either stands in one place or simply runs off, that is an example of soil that really is lacking in good soil structure and a definite lack of organic material in there. Organic material encourages that root growth. Because there's oxygen and there's some space within the soil, it's not compacted, it's not solid. Roots, young roots can just move out. If you've ever looked at the kind of material that is used for starting seeds, you'll notice that it's extremely light. And that's for these very young, new roots to be able to move out. And that's exactly what you want in your soil. The primary thing that organic material in the soil is going to allow is water to be available to your plants, because that's obviously fundamental to their growth. Next slide, please. As organic material increases in your soil, you'll see a number of things happen. The soil can absorb water faster. The water isn't going to just sit there on the top, it's going to move in. It also lessens the possibility of erosion through wind and rain. If you live here in New Mexico in Sandoval County over the last week and you looked outside, you saw a lot of blowing sand. That was essentially topsoil that was just being removed from areas that were lacking in organic material and didn't have anything growing on them. Water can be retained as you have organic material in your soils. And again, the important thing is that that is holding the water in a way that the plants can access it. Organic material is going to attract and hold more nutrients for the plants. It will increase the number and variety of microorganisms, which are just invaluable to creating a healthy soil, because those can help to reduce pathogens and diseases in the soil. Next slide, please. So what are the sources of organic material? Well, basically I put them into 4 categories: plants, mulch, cover crops, and compost. You know, Cover crops are something that you can put on your soil when you're not growing your tomatoes or whatever other vegetables you have. It is a way to hold the soil together. It's also a way to provide nutrients into the soil. Legume crops such as hairy vetch, clovers, these are called nitrogen fixers. These plants actually develop little nodules of nitrogen on their roots, so that if you happen to cut this plant off and look at its roots before it has flowered, you're going to find these little opaque nodules on the roots that contain nitrogen. I actually dug up a hairy vetch plant last season just to look at those little nodules. I then put that root system right back into the soil. The plant I had cut off and cut up and put it into the soil as well, because all of these provide organic material. Mulch is something that decomposes over time and again adds organic material to the soil, as does compost.
Put it on my phone, it works better. I can take a
Next slide, please. Okay, let's do a poll right now. I'd like you to tell me what kind of soil you have. Do you have sand, clay, loam, or do you frankly not have any idea?
Okay, we have about 80% of the people have voted, and I'm gonna end the
Okay.
polling right now.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Let's see what we have. Okay, so a lot of you have sand. Oh, me too. Some of you have clay. I'm sorry to hear that. Some of you have no idea. Well, I have some thoughts for you on that. But sand is what I started with. And let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so when I ask you what kind of soil you have, it's for a really good question, which is the question I'm always asked by people. How much water do I give my plants? The first question I ask them is, what kind of soil do you have? Because the kind of soil you have really does dictate how you're going to be watering your plants. If you have sandy soil, which is what I started with, which had no organic material in it, the soil doesn't hold water. So your plants need very frequent watering, but for short periods of time. A slow, deep watering in sand is basically going to waste the water because it's just going to run through it, and then the plants are going to wind up drying out. Now, clay soil, on the other hand, is very solid, and it holds that water, but it doesn't hold it in a way that the plants can really use it. And if you are gardening in clay soil, you want to give your plants very infrequent but deep watering. And I would like to add that compost can really help with clay soil, with aerating it and giving it some organic material that it definitely needs. Next slide, please. Now, loam, I did notice that some of you are gardening in loam. Well, you should be having very happy plants at this point, because that is their happy space. Loam has about 5% organic material. It has an even distribution of your sand, silt, and clay, and it holds some water, and it makes that available to the plants, which is really critical. Now, one of the things about the organic material, that 5%, I've actually been asked, what about if you have a lot more than 5% organic material? Some people have asked me, can I just put nothing but compost in a raised bed and grow my plants that way? And the answer is not really, no, you can't, because that organic material, as good as it is, it tends to be lacking in nitrogen, and it can also cause a much more greater concentration of phosphorus in the soil, which will also help to deplete the nitrogen that may be there and keep it away from the plants. But for those of you who don't know what you have, or you're not sure, I really recommend you have a soil test. and just see exactly what you have. Now, you can, if you would like to have a soil test, you can actually go to the Sandoval Master Gardener's website, and we have a link that will send you to Colorado State University to their soil testing site. That's where I have had 2 of my soil tests done, and they provide you with lots of really good information about the structure and content of your soil. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about what I did. Back in 08, when I became a master gardener, I really wanted to grow nice tomatoes. I didn't want to use chemicals. And I had sand, and I mean, it was sand. I live in the sand hills of Corrales. There's a reason they call it the sand hills, because it really is. So what I started doing for the first few years, I tilled in compost, nothing but compost. Then I went to an organic farming conference, and I went to a talk that there were very few people that attended the talk, but the individual was talking about the damage that tilling the soil actually does. Tilling the soil, what this individual was telling us, really breaks up the structure that's in there. Let's go to the next slide. Well, after listening to him, I decided that I really did not want to do any more tilling at all. So I stopped. What I started doing was just adding compost, and periodically I would put in cover crops, and periodically I would do soil tests. Now, what this means to add compost without tilling is basically you're just putting it on top of the soil and you're leaving it there. And when you go to put in your plants, you dig through the compost into the soil and put your plant in. But you do it carefully. As you increase your soil structure and increase your organic material, you're going to find a lot of life in the soil. Now, my daughter, who tends to be a little on the squeamish side, decided to help me plant my garden one Mother's Day a number of years ago. And every time she stuck the trowel in the soil, she brought up these giant red worms, and that just really turned her off to gardening for a few years, but she eventually got back to it. But it was at that point that I realized how much great stuff there was in the soil. There were so many worms. I didn't put them in there, they came. You know, the old adage, if you build it, they will come. Well, I guess if you really develop a great soil, you will get organic material coming into it. You will get life in there. A couple of years ago, I put the trowel in and brought up this big clump of dirt that I put on the side of the hole I was digging, and then realized that that clump of dirt was actually moving, and it was a big toad. So I put him back in the hole and covered it up and dug someplace else. Last year, I was shocked when I went into my garden. I saw a pink snake that was about 16 inches long, going across a path into a little area of dense growth. And I lost track of him at that point. But upon research, I found out it was a New Mexico blind snake, and that they live in the soil most of the time. And they feed on ants and spiders and termites. So you better believe that this year, when I dig the holes for all of the plants, I'm going to be extremely careful, because I don't want to encounter that snake and hurt it. Let's go to the next. Okay, now this was my garden in 2008. I tried an experiment that year that had to do with fencing rather than tomato cages. And I think you can probably see that that was a terrible failure. I didn't realize at the time that tomato plants were quite as strong as they were, and they essentially tore down all of the fencing. I found out that they also aren't totally impressed by those little tomato cages that are so cute and small. So I had to stop using those as well. We go on to the next slide.
Sam, I have a question here.
Sure.
Someone is asking how long you suggest that we cure our garden compost before we put it on top of our soil in this way.
Boy, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was just looking at compost yesterday from our compost, and I could still see a lot of eggshells in it. So I didn't think it was totally cured, but I went ahead and put it in anyway. I don't use manure, and that would probably be one of your critical things about using that compost, whether or not you have manure in it, because that's one of the sources of burning. I would also like to suggest that on our website, we have 2 fantastic presentations by a gentleman named John Zarola, who is a master composter. And John has done a home composting video that you can access, as well as one on amending desert soil, which goes into more detail than I will today. Is that good? Okay. So this was my garden in 2009. After the pandemonium that you saw of 2008, I decided to get really structured in 2009. So I have, this is showing mainly peppers, and then the tomatoes are in the very back. I used straw as a mulch that year. That turned out to be not the best idea. Here in New Mexico, we have a lot of high wind in the spring. And so what tended to happen is that the straw mulch went all kinds of places other than where I was trying to put it. So that was the last year I used straw mulch. I just basically turned it into this, just let it decompose into the soil for the most part. Next slide, please.
Sam, I have another question here.
Sure.
And this question is, would you talk about the difference between potting soil and compost?
Potting soil and compost. Potting soil is going to have nitrogen in it, probably added to it. It may have other things that prevent, that actually are aerators, like vermiculite. It has a lot of different things that the compost won't have. And frankly, I think the most enriching environment has a bit of both. I do some container gardening for my hot peppers, and I usually put in a potting soil as well as some compost. And frequently I'll just use the compost on the top as a mulch, because it works as a mulch as well as working it into the soil itself. Is that, I hope that helps.
Thank you, Sam.
Sure. Okay, this is my garden in 2014. If you can see over to the right, you may be able to see that those wire baskets are much more formidable than any of the ones you tend to find in most garden supply stores. This is more like a concrete reinforcing wire. And I have found that with indeterminate tomatoes are viners that basically keep growing until a frost kills them off. I have had vines from, I think it was Berkeley pink tie-dye. I had grafted that tomato one year, and I had vines that were 12 or 13 feet long that went from one plant over top of a few more. Extremely strong. Berkeley pink tie-dye is a fairly large tomato. And so my cages were still upright despite those. But what I've taken to doing is fixing them to the ground with some rebar. And that does keep the cage a lot stronger. But as you can see, in 2014, I had really good growth on the tomatoes. This is fairly early in the season, so you don't see any ripe tomatoes at this stage. Let's go on to the next slide.
Sam, I have a question too.
Sure.
About using downed fall leaves as mulch. Is that a good thing, or is that?
You know, it sort of depends on the kind of leaves. And this is something John Zarola, I believe, talked about in his composting talk. Somebody was talking about using cottonwood leaves, which are sort of a coated waxy leaf, and they don't decompose very quickly. I'm not sure I see a reason not to use them. I think I would try it and see if there are problems. One of the most important things to do in gardening is to really try to keep track of what you do from year to year and what works and what doesn't. Frankly, for me, mulch, my favorite mulch is really compost. I know what it is, but I will explain to you why I don't use it anymore. Let's look at this slide. In 2011, this is 3 years after I began trying to change my soil, my organic matter was up to 2.1%, according to the soil test. 5 years later, it was 7.5. Now, that 7.5 and the 2020 one of 6.6 are both above that optimum of 5%. So when that soil test came back, they specifically said to me, you don't need to add organic material. But my phosphorus was okay. So I wasn't into that danger zone of phosphorus taking nitrogen away from the plants. But in each case, they told me that what I needed to add was, in fact, nitrogen. What they recommended and what I have been doing are alfalfa pellets that are intended for rabbits. I buy a 20-pound bag, and that basically provides enough nitrogen to spread throughout the whole garden. And it is slow release. I treat it just like I did the organic material. I basically distribute it on the top and let it gradually decompose and feed nitrogen to the plants over the period of the growing season. Next, please.
Sam,
Yep.
what could you remind us again what the optimum amount of organic material in the soil is?
5%.
5%. And then is there anything that compost will not supply?
Nitrogen.
Just the nitrogen.
Typically, there's very little nitrogen in compost.
Okay. And then I have another question here about why shouldn't we use manure as a compost?
Oh,
Great.
I'm not saying you shouldn't use it, but there are a couple of qualifiers. It can be very hot, which can be damaging to the plants. So it has to be what they call cured. And again, I refer you to John Zarola's expertise in composting. I'm not an expert in that. I do not use manure for one reason, and that is frequently grass, hay, and alfalfa are treated with herbicides. And some of those herbicides can pass right through the animal and still be alive in the manure itself. And that can cause damage to the plants. And we have had episodes of that as recently as 2 years ago in a very large garden. So you have to be careful with what you have. Hopefully any compost that you would buy that has had manure added has been adequately cured, that the herbicides are no longer in it, but that's not always guaranteed.
Thank you.
Sam,
Next.
is there anything that compost does not supply?
From my soil tests, I would say nitrogen is about the only thing that has been lacking. And the only thing I have added in the past to the sand has been organic material. Okay, so to get back to the challenge of low fertility soil, if you have low fertility soil, you do have options. You can improve your soil as I did. And you can try the compost as I did, cover cropping. But the idea is if you build a healthy soil, you're going to have healthy plants. You can also use raised beds or containers. Now, there are plenty of tomato plants that are well adapted to containers. As a matter of fact, we're going to have a handout for you, and I've actually listed some varieties that I know and that fellow master gardeners who grow tomatoes have recommended as being excellently adapted to containers. And raised beds are always a wonderful option. You just have to bring in really top quality soil, and you can grow just fine in raised beds. Next slide, please. All right, now let's talk about temperatures. You know, I feel a lot in common with tomatoes. I don't like extreme temperatures. I'm really not into snow and cold, and I don't like a lot of heat. Tomatoes don't either. They don't really like going below 50 degrees. They don't like going above 85. They don't like those hot nighttime temperatures that are above 70 degrees. And essentially, when the temperatures get above 100 and around 104, they're just going into self-preservation mode. You know, the plants at that stage cannot be trying to grow produce for you. They're just trying to stay alive. Next slide, please.
And before you get a little bit into this, I have
Sure.
two questions. The first one is the alfalfa pellets that you're talking about. Do you buy the organic ones, or?
No, I've just been buying alfalfa pellets for rabbits at feed stores.
Okay.
I recommend the pellets that are intended for rabbits because they're small and they decompose much more quickly than the ones intended for horses. And I've actually tried both.
Okay, thank you.
But
And
yeah.
the other question is, do you have any recommended sources for compost to purchase?
Actually, if you want to buy it in bulk, which requires that you take a truck, we have some sources listed in the, you can contact the Master Gardener's email helpline, and they will send you a list of places that have bulk compost. Otherwise, there are lots and lots of sources for bagged compost. And I don't really know that compost of any one particular type is better than the other. When I was adding compost to my garden, I intentionally went to a different source every year so that I wasn't quite sure what was really in the compost. So I wanted to take advantage of bringing in everything I could in the way of microorganisms into the soil. And so I used cotton burr, I used, I think I used mushroom one year. I just used different things. And you can find those anyplace. Okay, so let's talk about temperature. Meg, is that good?
Yes, it is. Thank
Oh,
you.
okay, thank you. Okay, temperatures. Let's look at cold first. Now I said tomato plants don't really like temperatures below 50 degrees, and they really don't, but they can survive it. As a matter of fact, I have my tomato starts out in the greenhouse right now, and the temperatures have gotten down to 34. And those plants weren't particularly happy in the morning, but they perked up 2 hours later. So, you know, what doesn't kill them makes them stronger. And these guys just got a lot stronger after 34 degrees. What the cold actually does to the plant really depends on what its growing cycle is. Next slide, please. If in fact you have fruit that's ripening on your tomato plant, such as in the fall, then it may take that fruit longer to ripen. And I think you can see this in the fall when the nighttime temperatures start to drop. The fruit is sitting there and it's green for much longer. If you happen to have flowers that have pollen in production, that's going to decrease with the cold. And you can also get some deformities like cat face. Should we go on to the next one? On the right, that's what they call cat face. Why they call it that, I have absolutely no idea. But this is something that here in New Mexico, you may see late in the season when those nighttime temperatures have gotten kind of cold. Now on the left, that's cracking. And that is also something that we tend to see in the fall, mainly because cracking occurs when a tomato has reached its full size with the skin, and then it is given a shot of more nitrogen or water that has led it to try to grow even more. And so it tries to expand and it cracks. I have seen this most often in the fall when we have a monsoon season, where, because I always water in the morning, and then an afternoon rain comes and adds more nitrogen-rich rain and water to the plant, and boom, we start to get cracking in the tomatoes. Now, the way to get around this, there are a couple of ways, but number one, there are varieties that are crack resistant. I only grow heirlooms and open pollinators, so none of my plants are adapted to these kind of things. I just deal with it. It doesn't interfere with how the tomato tastes. It just interferes with the way it looks. With the cat face, you can just cut out that section, and the same with the cracking, and the rest of the tomato is fine. Next slide, please. The one thing about temperature extremes, there's a lot you can do about the cold. You can provide, there's some things called Agribond frost protection cloth that you can put over the plants. A friend of mine likes to use walls of water. You can have a greenhouse, a cold frame. You can keep the tomatoes in a container that you bring in if the night's going to be too cold. The one thing to bear in mind, if you use a cold frame, greenhouse, walls of water, or the frost protection, is that the next day when the sun comes up, things are going to heat up very quickly. I tried walls of water once, and I will tell you very honestly, I went off to work and left the walls of water around the tomato plant, came home and it was fried. So you really have to pay attention to opening up and making sure that the plants are only offered that extreme protection at night when it's cold. When it warms up, give them some air and cool. Next slide, please. The real challenge we have here in New Mexico is with our heat. As you can see, the optimum temperatures for growing tomatoes is between 68 and 86. And you know, we don't really have a lot of days that are within those ranges. We've got some right now, but the nights are too cold to have the tomatoes in. Growth slows down when it gets above 86, and it stops when it gets around 104. Next slide, please. There are a variety of problems that are going to happen with the high temperatures. Pollen can get sticky. Now, tomatoes are self-pollinators, but that pollen has to be able to move within the flower in order to set the fruit. One thing that you can do when the temperatures are high and you have blossoms on your tomato plants is to give them a little shake. Not a real vigorous shake, but just a little shake to try to move that pollen around. If the temperatures are so high and the plant is so susceptible to the heat, the blossoms will drop. Your flower production may be greatly reduced. The other thing to bear in mind is really high temperatures stress the plant. And a stressed plant is at increased risk for any kind of insect predation and disease. And that's where a lot of us see problems. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'd like to do a little poll and ask you what type of
It's okay, keep going.
what type of tomatoes you think grow best in high heat.
There we go.
Small tomatoes?
Oh my God. There we go.
Locations? No.
I'm
Small
going-
tomatoes, large tomatoes.
There we go.
I still don't see it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if you would take this poll, we also have on it tomatoes that are indigenous to hot, dry climates, hybrids, and tomatoes that your neighbor's been growing successfully for years. So what do we have?
All right, I'm going to end the polling right now. And there we go.
Okay. Oh boy, I'm not sure I have much to teach you guys. You're rocking it. Yep, definitely right about the tomatoes indigenous to the hot, dry climates, the small ones. I will tell you, there are quite a few tomatoes that are hybrids that are pretty well adapted to the heat. One of the important things when you're looking for tomatoes that are adapted to heat is make sure it's dry heat. A lot of research has been done for the southern climes where the humidity is much greater than it is here. So just be sure you're looking at the right kind of heat. But you guys are on the right track. You know, the large tomatoes tend to be a problem. Okay, Paget, let's go on.
Sam, could you tell us a little bit more about, or a little bit about how days to maturity and how the high temperatures can change?
Okay, that's really, thank you, Paget. That's really a good point. That is the biggest problem with your large tomatoes. Large tomatoes take a long time to go from putting it in the ground to when you harvest your first tomato plant or your first tomato. And that's what they refer to as days to maturity. So if you have many days that are in the hundreds, basically that plant has stopped. It's trying to just survive. And so that tomato that's sitting on it is going to take that much longer to reach its maturity stage. I had a call a few years ago from a gardener who, I believe it was sometime later in October, who still had just all green tomatoes and they were not ripening. Well, it turned out he was growing all brandywines, which have a very long days to maturity. And because of those hot days and then the cool nights of the fall, the tomatoes just were not harvestable. They were still going to be green for quite a long time. So that's why I really recommend to people that you grow a variety of sizes. You may just love the taste of those great big tomatoes, those huge beefsteaks, and they may grow just fine. You may have a good season for them. And then again, you may not. The tomato specialist or the vegetable specialist at NMSU grew brandywines one year. And Stephanie, for all of her work, had one tomato at the end. And when you think of all the time and the water and the effort you're putting into it, you want more than just one tomato. At least I do. I want plenty. So I grow all kinds of different sizes. And that photo at the very beginning of the talk, those were all my tomatoes. So I do like a variety of sizes. Next slide, please.
Sam,
yeah.
Before
Sure.
we go on, I have a question here. Are small tomatoes considered cherry tomatoes, or are there other tomatoes that are also small?
There are actually quite a few tomatoes that are small. So I think you're talking about how small. There are pear-shaped little tomatoes. There are grape type tomatoes that grow almost the way grapes do, with a little cluster of tomatoes. There are cherries. There are some salad-sized tomatoes, which are just about the size of maybe 4 cherry tomatoes. And all of those different ones tend to do extremely well here and basically ignore the heat and continue to grow. And again, those are going to be listed. Some of those varieties will be listed on that handout we'll have for you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So what do you do about the heat? Well, I go back to the adage, location, location, location. Next. I'd like you to look at the top of the slide. What you see up there is 30% shade cloth. I began using shade back, well, actually 2008, I believe, was the first year I used it, because I had listened to one of the specialists from NMSU during my training talked about some experimental work someone was doing with using snow fencing to create shade for tomato plants and how that seemed to be improving their growth. So back in 2008, I began using shade cloth, and I've used it ever since. It is really, in this case, the shade cloth is 30%. It's oriented north to south. So all of the plants still get a little bit of direct sun, but not a great deal. And that the distance from the ground to that shade cloth is about 7 feet. And I water in the morning with tea tape. And when you walk into the garden, it is noticeably cooler than the area outside. And that is really something that my sweet peppers and my tomatoes greatly appreciate. And as a gardener, I appreciate it. It really helps to have a shaded environment. There are also some predatory insects that are just really death to tomato plants that do not like shade. So it's an added benefit to use shade cloth. Next, please. So when you see a description for a tomato that says it likes full sun, it's just important to recognize that that's not 5,000 feet full sun. It's not the kind of sun that we have here and the kind of heat. I have a good friend in Albuquerque, and she and her husband grow fabulous tomatoes. And I've been over there and looked at how they're doing it. Their tomatoes are shaded by noon. So they get morning sun, then they have shade the rest of the day, and they have tremendous bumper crops of tomatoes. It's really not critical that tomatoes get more than about 5 or 6 hours of sunlight. As I had said, I water early in the morning. I try to grow tomato plants that have adjusted to our heat. I'm not willing to wait until October for a tomato. I want tomatoes that can be grown during the heat of our summers. Mulch is also another way. It keeps moisture in and it can keep the heat down on your plants. Next, please.
Sam, I have a couple of questions. One
Sure.
is about the shade cloth. Is it cloth or is it something else, and where does that come from?
Okay, it is a woven cloth and it is called shade cloth if you're looking for it. And there are different colors and there are different grades. I have seen it at nurseries. I've seen it at a lot of garden supplies online. That shade cloth that was in the photograph that I used for the first time in 2008, I still use that shade cloth. So it was initially a fairly expensive investment. I think it probably cost me about $120 for a large roll, but I've used it every year since. It's something that does not decay at all that I can tell.
Okay, and so it was noticed that you had stripes in the garden. Is that on purpose, or was that just because you didn't have enough shade cloth?
No, that was on purpose. That was
Because-
something I did purposefully. I thought that might be a good idea. Frankly, I don't know that it's a good idea. I could probably have the whole thing shaded and it'd be just fine.
Okay. And then do you recommend a different method of shading for raised beds?
No, actually, I would recommend the same kind of thing where you could, but just elevate it, because you want to make sure your plants still have plenty of air flowing around them. As I said, tomatoes are self-pollinators, so you want the air to be able to move the plant. So don't put the shade cloth too close that it kind of compresses the airflow around the plant.
Okay, and in that picture, there was white around the edge of your garden. Is that for wind or is that something else?
That's something else, and we're going to get to that in just a few minutes.
All right, thank you.
That white around there is something called row cover, and I will talk about what we do with that in a couple of minutes. Anyway, let's go on to the next. Okay, so what does heat stress look like? Well, this is what it looks like at the end of the day. It's wilt, it's curled leaves. A plant looking like this at the end of a hot day, that's pretty normal. If the plant still looks like that in the morning, there's another source of stress that you want to be looking for. Next slide. So that source would be insects or diseases. So let's spend a little bit of time on that. The first thing you really need to do is always inspect your plants. You need to look low at those bottom leaves. You want to look at the top of the leaf, the bottom of the leaf. You want to look at the stems. You want to look at the new growth. At least once a week, if not more often. It's just a good idea to see exactly what's happening with your plant. You also want to make sure if you have a plant that appears to have a disease, if you've confirmed that, you need to take that plant out of there. You need to be very careful with it. What I do, which has worked quite well, is I will put a large trash bag over the plant and then gently pull it up. That way I don't want anything about that plant to touch one of the other plants that's currently healthy. So I strongly recommend you just be very careful with that. You need to control your weeds in your garden and around your garden, and keep your tools clean. I tend to keep a spray bottle of rubbing alcohol that I use on pruners and things, just to keep from transferring one problem with one plant to any others that are currently healthy. And then the last thing I strongly suggest is you bring in help. There are all kinds of things you can do to combat insects and diseases. And those include insect barrier, which is what you saw in that picture, that white stuff, that row cover, that's an insect barrier. You can also try to attract beneficial insects and companion plant and try to improve your soil and the microbes within it. Next slide, please. Well, I'm sure if you live here in the Southwest, you've seen this. You have a row of beautiful, healthy tomato plants, and then you've got one that just died, it seems like, in just a couple of days. The most common virus we have in the Southwest is curly top virus, and it's caused by this little bitty insect called a beet leafhopper. Now that little guy overwinters in mustard plants, which is one of the reasons I strongly suggest you pull up as many of your weeds around your garden as possible. Now, the only other issue with the beet leafhopper is that it's easily carried on the wind. So even though you may be doing everything right, you may have neighbors that are not. And with our spring winds, which is when the leafhopper is out in May and June, that little critter can be carried on the wind. So what you're going to watch for in your plant, you're going to see leaf curl. Now, leaf curl is the sign of lots and lots of things. So that's not your definitive conclusion if you have leaf curl. But if you see color changes, if you're yellowing leaves, purple veins, if you see spots or specks on the leaves, that's not curly top, that's something else. But curly top is really a disease that tends to strike your young plants. It strikes them very quickly and it kills them just almost immediately. I have had what appeared to be curly top attack a very large full-grown plant, and it slowed it down, but it didn't kill it. One other thing with beet curly top, or with a beet leafhopper, not all beet leafhoppers carry the curly top virus, but if one doesn't carry the virus and happens to bite a plant that is infected with curly top, then that leafhopper contracts the virus and can spread it to other plants. Next slide, please. Now, another one of those little critters that you can't see that's causing a problem are thrips. And unfortunately, they love our hot, dry conditions. You're going to notice that you have a problem with spotted wilt virus because the color of the leaves, the young leaves are going to change. They're going to start bronzing. You're going to see dark spots. Leaves may drop. Interestingly enough, apparently half of the plant can be infected with this, but the other half look normal. I've never actually seen that. I've had spotted wilt virus, but I've never seen it just attack part of a plant. Next slide, please.
Sam, I have a couple of questions here.
Sure.
One is it all right to have a bee house hanging near tomatoes?
I don't see why not.
Okay. And then the other question is, are you going to talk about crop rotation and what kinds of plants help tomatoes thrive in the
Yes.
off years? Okay.
Definitely going to talk about those things. And if I don't, you need to ask me again because I should. Okay, here's what I suggest with the problem of thrips and beet leafhoppers. This is called row cover or insect barrier. It goes by both names. And what I do is I wrap my tomato cages completely. I close the top, the bottom, I put soil on the bottom of the row cover. So it is really completely enclosed. And I do this as soon as the plant goes in the ground. Last year, I was a little bit slower with one of my plants and I finally covered it up. And then I would periodically go in and look at it. And I realized that a leafhopper had probably gotten in there when I was planting it because the plant was dying. So I took it out immediately, put another plant in, which was just fine. But you have to be careful. Just cover these things up. Don't plant the tomato plants and come back a week later and cover them up, because you could be actually putting the problem inside with the plant. The other thing is the shade cloth. Leafhoppers do not care for the shade. So having the plant covered with row cover and using shade cloth can help you reduce the incidence of losing plants to curly top virus. Also, if you happen to have any mustard plants around, you want to remove them. Now with the infected plants, as I said, just really cover those guys up and remove them. Try your very best not to have any of the plant debris from a diseased plant left around, and do not compost it. There are some plant resistant varieties, but only to spotted wilt virus. No varieties have been developed yet that are resistant to curly top. We had some seeds a few years ago that were sent to us to try that were supposed to be a resistant variety of tomato to beat curly top, but that was not the case. So at this stage, prevention is about the only thing you can do to save your plants from beat curly top or curly top virus. Next one, please.
Sam, how long do you recommend leaving them, the plants covered in that way for this reason?
I do that as long as possible. I will allow the plant to start coming up to the top and curling back down a little bit before I open up the top, particularly depending upon the time of the year. Ideally, I don't really want that plant to be uncovered until later in June, if at all possible. Now, sometimes it's just not possible because the plants are vigorous and they're just poking out every way they can. In which case, you hope the plant is vigorous enough to withstand an attack if it happens.
Thank you.
Please. Mm-hmm. There are also some soil-borne diseases that you need to be aware of. I've known of cases of Fusarium Wilt in Albuquerque, and you're not actually going to be able to, you're going to see dying leaves on the plant, but the real tell on these two wilts are if you cut the stem and look at the inside of the stem, it's going to be brownish in color. That typically, if you want to know which disease it is, you need to have a lab test to determine it. There are some tomato plants that are resistant to these types of diseases. If you have this in your soil, the only thing you can do is either plant resistant varieties or not plant tomatoes there for at least 5 years. It's a pretty serious disease that's in the soil, and you can't plant non-resistant plants in there and expect a good outcome. In sandy soil, we do tend to have root knot nematodes. These are microscopic worms that feed on roots. So if you had a very stunted yellow plant, you could pull it up and look at the roots and you might see these little guys in it. Now, there are some varieties, again, that are resistant. There are hybrids that have been developed that are resistant to root knot nematodes. The other thing is supposedly French marigolds help to attract root knot nematodes to themselves and away from the tomato plants. I've heard contradictory evidence about that, but that's one thing that would be possible to try. Next, please.
Sam, there's a question here. Can you solarize the soil to kill off disease? And can you talk about what that is?
Yes, solarization is putting plastic over the soil and allowing it to heat up to very high temperatures, and basically you're killing everything in it. You certainly can solarize the soil. the thing is, you've lost everything that's in it. But that is probably one of the most effective things to do if you do happen to have either of these wilts or the nematodes. But it's something, it's such an extreme measure. I think it would be very important to confirm with a lab test exactly what you have in the soil before doing something like that.
Okay, and is this lab test, is it of the plant or of the soil? How does that work?
This is something that I think what I would do is contact the extension agent and deal directly with the laboratory down at NMSU, the pathology lab, to find out exactly what they need from the plant to identify it. I believe it is a little bit of both. I think you need to send in some root material as well as some of the top material. But again, I would, my memory may be a little faded on that because when this happened with Fusarium Wilt, that was a number of years ago. So I would concentrate on contacting the lab and getting direct specifications from them as to what the sample needs to include to get a conclusive diagnosis. I'm sure everybody's seen these guys. Probably the most fun I ever had with a hornworm, if you can call it having fun with a hornworm, was at the Seed to Need garden when some kids from California were out there helping with the garden. And I guess these kids were from a very sheltered environment and had never encountered much in the way of gardening stuff. And a gal came up with one of these guys, very excited. She had found the unicorn caterpillar, which we all thought was just fabulous, but take those unicorn caterpillars and get them out of here because we didn't need them. So I'm sure she took it home and grew it into a lovely hawk moth, but frankly, I'd rather give them to my chickens. These guys can chew through and defoliate the leaves on a plant in no time. Now the pupae overwinters in our soil and they tend to come out in June. I know we all sit around and go, where did these guys come from? Well, they actually came out of our soil. And I've just learned recently that there's apparently a second generation of them that may come out in August as well. What I recommend is if you can get yourself a little black light flashlight and go out at night, these guys will be on top of the stems and leaves and they glow in the dark. So they're much easier to find because their color is so perfectly matched to the tomato plant. They're so hard to find during the day. I usually find them by looking for those little black pebbles of poop. And if you go straight up from there, you usually find the guys, but not always. So if you go out at night with a black light, just take a little container of soapy water with you and you can just toss them in there. Next, please. Okay, so keeping your plants healthy. Obviously, good cultural practices, clean tools, controlling weeds. The other thing is don't over fertilize. Too much nitrogen can be a problem. You may get the most gorgeous, green, big leafed tomato plants, but you won't get many tomatoes. You can really overdo it with nitrogen. Also, during the heat of the summer, it can be an added stress to the plant. So that's one of the reasons I really like using the alfalfa pellets, because it is something that just slowly decays over time and it doesn't tend to put any stress on the plant. It doesn't overdo it. I also heartily recommend the use of shade cloth, but more important, really strive to create as healthy a soil as you can, because good healthy soil is going to produce good healthy plants. Now, I know that everybody talks about the need to do rotation of crops and not to plant the same thing in the same place. Since 2008, I have 3 rows in my garden that are large enough to hold tomatoes. Every year since 2008, 2 of those rows have held tomato plants. And I have not had any diseases in my garden. No soil diseases. I have extremely healthy soil, high in organic material. And I've talked to specialists, vegetable specialists, about why it might be that I'm getting away with this, because I do feel like I'm getting away with something. And the only thing we can come up with is that I have intentionally grown a great variety of companions to the tomato plants. And I'm going to show you some pictures of them in a minute. But that has maybe helped me to develop a lot of different microorganisms in that soil that has created an extremely healthy soil. I certainly can't say to you, don't bother rotating, because rotating is the best way to avoid problems. But what I'm saying is that maybe there are some other things you can do that make rotation a little less required. So let's go on. All right, here are my favorite guys. These are what I consider the big guns that I use in the garden. And they're basically beneficial insects. And a beneficial insect is somebody who can help you with pollination, but more importantly is going to attack some of those insects that are going to cause you problems. You know, parasitic wasps destroy tomato hornworms. I don't think you want to watch it happening because it's pretty gross, but you know, they can do it. Ladybugs eat aphids like crazy. Praying mantis eat grasshoppers. I didn't realize assassin bugs eat leafhoppers. And my favorites, lacewings, they eat all of those little soft-bodied guys that can cause all kinds of problems in the garden. Next, please. I really would like to recommend this booklet to you. It's Backyard Beneficial Insects in New Mexico. It's a guide, a recent guide put out by NMSU, and it talks about the pollinators and the natural enemies of pests. And this is a leafhopper. They're gorgeous little fellows that you can find in the garden. They're probably maybe ½ an inch long, and they're just lovely, and they're in there helping. And then the assassin bug, I've never seen one of those, but I really hope to attract some very soon. Next, please. All right, here's what I do. Now, you can probably tell I sort of use plants as mulch, because these pictures were taken, this looks like maybe a June picture. I've got a mix in here. Sweet Alyssum is something that's always a staple in my garden. It's an annual. I grow it from seed and I put it in the garden every year. Currently, it's in my garden and it is blooming. And that's intentional, because what I find on Alyssum early in the year are lacewings. And last year I found lots and lots of them. But importantly, I have a lot of different things in the garden. Now, since I don't till, the volunteerism of plants in my garden is huge. I seeded Cosmos probably 6 or 7 years ago. I haven't seeded it since, but it grows every year. I have plenty of Cosmos. I have nasturtiums that volunteer. Last year, I had the most gorgeous marigolds, French marigolds that I'd ever had, that were huge. I mean, huge, probably a foot square plants of marigolds that were volunteers. So lots of these things come up. I have dill. I mean, the actual vegetable in the right, Paget, if you could put your cursor on it, if you can find the pepper plant, it's there. Yep, there it is. That's the pepper plant, and all that other stuff around it are companion plants. They're intended to attract beneficial insects and pollinators. And it really seems to work. And it's fun. You know, you can have all kinds of plants in there. I use parsley, I use basil. I use, like I say, Alyssum. Let's go to the next one. The next slide. There we go. Okay. This is a picture I took last May in my garden. I have one row in the garden that is near some trees and some large sumac bushes. So there's a lot of competition for water, and I don't grow any vegetables right there. But I had been reading an article that was put out by NMSU about an insectary seed mix that was being experimented with to help bring in beneficials that would protect vegetable crops. And I was so taken with it that I went and got the proportion of seeds that was suggested in the article, and I seeded this particular row in my garden. And what you see, those beautiful little cobalt blue flowers are California bluebells. What you can't see that's also in bloom are Alyssum. What was remarkable watching this particular row develop over the season was how different flowers came in at different times, and they were of different sizes. So the Cosmos was actually the very last one to come in, and those were the largest flowers. Before that, Coreopsis. But the first ones that came in were the Alyssum and the bluebells, and those were extremely attractive to lacewings. And then the dill as well that came in, and prairie Coreopsis. The other thing I did with this, I grow hot peppers in whiskey barrel containers that are in a different area of my garden that are not protected. And one year I had lost all of my Aleppo peppers to a leaf foot bug that had just sucked all the juice out of all those peppers. So I decided to take this insectary seed mix and I put it into window boxes. And I put those window boxes around my different containers of hot peppers last year. Well, I didn't lose any to insects last year. Now, I don't know, it could be I was just lucky, or it could be the insectary mix was really doing something, but I intend to keep going. I have my window boxes already started with the insectary seeds, and I have seeded this row again to have it come up again and hopefully protect the plants. But I recommend you look at a variety of options. I myself do not like to use pesticides. So using something like this for me is just optimum. It's a nice way to try to manage the pests that would destroy the garden. Next, please. So to kind of sum up what my tips for growing tomatoes in the desert Southwest, get organic matter into your soil. Whether you've got sand, whether you've got clay, you can use organic matter to help improve that soil. Strongly recommend shade, particularly from the afternoon sun. One thing you want to be careful of, frequently people have growing beds near block walls, and those things can be heat traps. So you need to look at the places where you're going to have your plants, check them. You know, now is a good time to go out and start looking at where you think you're going to be putting those plants and see what it looks like. What's the sun like? You know, if you've got a particular corner where you want to put your plants, but the sun is really beating down on it from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock, that's going to be a difficult growing environment. I strongly suggest you water in the morning. Now that's watering the ground, not the plants. You don't want to be spraying the plants. You just want to water right on the ground. Use mulch. Mulch can really help to reduce the soil temperature. Avoid overdoing the nitrogen. I can't tell you how much I think insect barrier helps you to protect your plants. It's really a great way. I mean, the insects are there, they're hard to see. No matter what I do with beneficial insects, I will still always be covering my tomato plants with row cover. And add plants to your vegetable garden that will attract those beneficials. It also adds variety. The one thing you don't want to put in there, I can't even remember what it is. I'll get back to it. But you want to make sure that the plants you grow are companionable to your tomato plants. There are so many of them out there. Right now, I have carrots that are growing that will be near the tomatoes. There's a wonderful book called Carrots Love Tomatoes that talks about companion plants. There are also, I'm sure, plenty of websites where you can find that information, but it's nice to put in plants that work well together. Actually, your cover crops like hairy vetch can be grown at the same time as the tomatoes. I have had tomato cages where I've had hairy vetch growing inside, and they were totally companionable. There was no problem with having both of them there. I did not get the sense that the hairy vetch took anything from the tomato plants at all. It was just fine together. Next.
Sam, was that fennel that you were trying to remember?
Oh, that's it. Thank you so much. That's it. Yes, I was going to grow fennel this year, and I discovered that no vegetables like to grow around fennel. So I have no idea what I'm going to do with those seeds, but I haven't started them. Anyway, 2020 was a pretty bad year for a lot of things, but this was my tomato garden in June of 2020. So it kind of worked out last year, and I'm hoping it's going to work out this year.